welcome all to the second of this semester's Asia Center seminars. I'm Andrew Gordon, and I'm the acting director this year of the Harvard Asia Center, and I'm having fun doing it. It's fun to do it for just a year. And one of the things the Asia Center tries to do, perhaps its most important thing, is to promote the study, the research, and the public engagement with Asia as a whole, both comparatively, cross-border, transnationally, and reaching out from Asia to the world. And so the Asia Center seminars are designed to showcase that type of inquiry. And last June, I had just been asked to be the acting director, and then the Brexit vote took me, like everybody, by surprise. And as I thought about it a little bit, it seemed certain that there would not only be concerns in Asia, but they wouldn't all be the same, and that they might vary particularly by region as well as by, there are many ways concerns could vary. Women and men can think about something differently, social classes could think about something differently, but this seemed to be a case where really the place you are in Asia might have an impact. So I thought it would be useful, interesting to bring together people who could speak to that. And I'm very happy at the panel we've been able to assemble today. Let me introduce briefly our two speakers and our discussant, and then we'll turn it over to them. First, we'll hear from Professor William Grimes, who has come from us from just across the Charles River. He's an associate dean for academic affairs and a professor of international relations at Boston University at its Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies. And he's been there since 1996. No, 60, he's much younger. 96, excuse me. 9s and 6s kind of look similar. And he was here briefly as a postdoctoral researcher and is known, I think, to many of you. He's written several books. The first, the Unmaking the Japanese Miracle, Macroeconomic Politics from 1985 to 2000, which is a topic I'm quite interested in. And then, I think of greatest relevance to the questions we're dealing with today, a book in 2008, Currency and Contest in East Asia, The Great Power Politics of Financial Regionalism. And that book won prizes, it's received tremendous recognition, and his current research is following this forward to look at the effects of the 2008-9 global financial crisis on regional cooperation as well as competition in the financial market centers of East Asia. So we'll hear first from Bill Grimes. Then I'll turn to Professor Devesh Kapoor, who is at the University of Pennsylvania. He directs their Center for the Advanced Study of India, and he's a professor of political science. And he has the Madan Lal Sobti Chair for the Study of Contemporary India. Devesh is also probably known to some of you, or many of you, as he was here at Harvard as an associate professor of government in the late 90s to the mid-2000s, I believe, and then at the University of Texas at Austin before moving to UPenn. And his research focuses on human capital and national and international public institutions and the way in which local and global linkages affect political change in developing countries. His particular focus is on international migration and international institutions, and particularly India. So between Bill and Devesh, we're covering from Northeast Asia to South Asia. And we'll then hear from our discussant, who I believe is also known to many of you, William Overholt. Bill Overholt is here at the Harvard Asia Center as a senior fellow. He's also been a senior fellow at the Fund Global Institute recently in 2013 to 15, based in Hong Kong. And he's had many positions in public affairs, policy, advising of governments, including a stint from 2002 to 2008 with the RAND Corporation's Center for Asia Pacific Policy as a distinguished chair and director there. He served as the head of strategy and economics for Nomura, the Japanese financial institution, from 1998 to 2001, and before that he was based in Singapore as a managing director at Bank Boston Singapore. So I will, after about 20 minutes each from our two speakers, I'll have turn to Bill for 10 to 15 minutes of comments, and then we'll have time for discussion involving all of you. Unfortunately, our videographer has to leave after about an hour, so your own that will more or less coincide with the end of the remarks from the three presenters, so your own comments will end up not being filmed, but we'll have a record of the event itself. And so with that, let me turn things over to Bill Grimes.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to sit here, and honestly, part of the reason I'm here is to listen to Bill and Devesh and hear what they have to say. And I'll try to keep the initial comments fairly brief so that we can have a good discussion, as in fact I was asked to do. So instead of the usual academic, I'll give a 20-minute talk for half an hour or so. I will intend actually to keep this to 20 minutes. My task was to think about this coming from East Asia, and I have a particular focus on Japan, although I'll come out a little while towards the end to think a little bit more broadly about how it might be seen elsewhere in East Asia. I'll start with economic issues, and then I'll move on to thinking about maybe some other political issues that are relevant. So the first point, I should start by saying that I've never come across something in Japanese politics and economy on which there's basically no variation at all in the way that the government, big business, Nikkei, Asahi describe this thing. All of them are very concerned about particular aspects of Japan's economic links with the UK and into Europe. And they also, at least some of them when they bring it up, will ask about what this means for globalization and the project of Europe. There's no meaningful distinction. I had my research assistant here very kindly look things up over a period of time and across the newspaper. It doesn't matter. It's basically quite similar. We have in terms of the economic links, there's two stories. One is the particular links. Trade is not the story. UK accounts for only 1.5% of Japan's total trade. If you pull back over a period of 25 or 30 years, the highest you get is 2.5%. This is not our story. Our story really is about FDI. The UK is close to 10% of Japanese foreign direct investment over the past 5 years, 6-year period actually. And if I decided to cherry pick 2015, it was over 14%. It has become the gateway to Europe for many companies, and you can see that there's 1,000 firms operating there. I'll just show you a quick picture here. So the UK share of Japanese foreign direct investment to Europe is quite high. At times, it was extremely high, and now we'll just call it quite high. So 40 to 50%. And if you think cumulatively, there's an extraordinary level there's an extraordinary level of FDI in Europe, of Japanese FDI going to Europe is based in the UK. This is broken down into manufacturing, particularly. With manufacturing, it's automakers, pharma, and IT hardware. The automakers and the IT hardware folks are primarily selling in Europe. So that's true for the big automakers like Nissan. It's true for the big IT hardware companies like Fujitsu. And these are not small operations. Fujitsu has 12,000 people there. Nissan has one of its biggest plants outside of Japan. All of these companies rely on the access to European markets, in other words, to make this a worthwhile endeavor. The same is true, if not probably even more so for services. And here this is the crux of a lot of Japanese investment in the UK, particularly financial institutions, the three We no longer call people still call them mega banks. When the mega banks merged, I started calling them giga banks, but nobody else has taken this up. But I'm going to call them the 3 giga banks, and also Nomura, which is its own giga something, and a variety of other Japanese financial institutions. There's also retailers and wholesalers all have their European operations based there. Services have a particular challenge if indeed there's not some sort of proper modus vivendi in terms of how the UK ends up working with the EU. As we know, the UK's preferred outcome is to have all the privileges of being in the EU without having to follow the rules in terms of immigration and in terms of certain types of regulation. This may be an unlikely outcome, no matter what the voters seem to think they were likely to get. For auto manufacturers or for IT hardware manufacturers, that means that they potentially have to go through customs and meet European tariffs. These are not very high. And particularly in IT hardware, they're basically zero because of the ITA. But for finance and for other services, this is an enormous problem because you don't know if you have the single passport into the European markets. You don't know how taxation will work. They don't know how to deal with issues like data localization, which sounds like a minor issue, but is a really, really major issue for financial institutions and for service companies in general. So from the Japanese point of view, this is potentially a major issue. And I'll talk a little bit more about the extent to which that might make a difference in a moment. The other economic story is about macro fears. And you hear concerns about market volatility in the currency and equity markets. And indeed, I probably should have organized these a little differently again, sorry. What we see is more or less immediately, you saw currency effects, right? So this is Brexit, and you see at the yen, you see this rapid appreciation of the yen, which looks a lot like the classic safe haven story for currency. Japanese companies have traditionally been quite sensitive to movements in the yen, and this was seen as really quite a remarkable problem. And by you actually saw a dip under or over 100 yen to the dollar briefly on intraday trading. But what we see is that over the course of time, it doesn't look that much different from trend. Trend was sort of on its way down there anyway. We're not seeing necessarily a long-term effect from Brexit. This is equity effects. This is looking at the Nikkei average again. You can easily identify Brexit, but you can also easily identify the markets at least seem a little bit less concerned than they were earlier. So that story remains a major issue. The other piece is about uncertainty, and there's particularly for the Japanese companies that are invested in the UK and working with the UK, regulatory uncertainty is a major issue. Do I go and we'll see the Nissan plant in Sunderland was talking about a major upgrading and expansion. Do we do it? Answer is don't know. This was planned. It is now postponed. It's not going to be the only case of this, and that'll be true for a lot of Japanese companies. There's also uncertainty over what this means for European markets, for the growth of demand in Europe generally, as well as in the UK, and whether that's going to lead to concerns elsewhere. As I said, the Japanese press and government and companies have shown remarkably uniform reactions. And in fact, in what I believe is unique, I could be wrong, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs put this note, this is the font that they used on their website, saying this is our message to the United Kingdom and the European Union. The government of Japan trusts that the UK and the EU will maintain the current business environment or alleviate the impacts of any radical changes. It's the sort of thing that, of course, they should have been communicating, but we're not used to seeing up front. This is of great importance. And I don't expect anybody to be able to read this, and I promise I won't go through it. But this is a summary of the demands that are contained in that particular message to the United Kingdom and the European Union. And it has to do with certainly all of the things that one might assume. And I'll just read a couple of additional quotes from that. So the document states, provides some factual information for us. There are numerous Japanese businesses operating in Europe which have created 440,000 jobs. A considerable number of these firms are concentrated in the UK. Nearly half of Japanese direct investment intended for the EU in 2015 flowed to the UK, and the UK was one of the major destinations for Japan's investment stock within the EU as of the end of last year. They go on to say, uncertainty is a major concern for an economy. It evokes a sense of anxiety, causing volatility in markets, and results in the contraction of trade, investment, and credit. What Japanese businesses in Europe most wish to avoid is the situation in which they are unable to discern clearly the way the Brexit negotiations are going, only grasping the whole picture at the last minute. It is imperative for the UK and EU, imperative, which is not words that Japanese diplomats always use in instructing other countries. It is imperative for the UK and the EU to regain the confidence of the world and ensure their unwavering competitiveness by increasing the predictability of the Brexit process, ensuring the outcome is free of unpleasant surprises, and reducing the risks emanating from uncertainty. This is I think, reflective of the grave concern that the Japanese companies have. And as we saw, this is where 10% or so of Japanese investment around the world is going. I already showed you this picture here. This is a picture of who's doing business. And here we can see, again, the breakdown. The larger companies are much more like, this is from a Teikoku Databank survey. They sent out to over 20,000 firms. They got responses from over 10,000. And what we can see is that 13% of major businesses state that they have involvement in the UK economy, and then of this, the 4.5% is direct investment, 9.5% is other linkages such as trade or technology agreements or whatever. And here, manufacturing is our big one, and wholesaling and retailing. Excuse me, my hands tend to shake when I drink coffee, so maybe I need to use two hands. Finance, you can see, is actually, even though it's not the highest level of number of companies that have involvement in the UK, it is the highest level of companies, of financial institutions, that have investments in the UK. And as I said, these include Japan's very, very largest international financial institutions. So we see big companies are very closely involved. The major sectors of the Japanese economy are those companies are very, very closely involved. And then, of course, one has to think from the other direction as well, which is, does the UK care what Japan thinks? Well, it depends on how you think about it. But Japan accounts for a very small sliver of UK total trade. I forget the exact number, but it's in the single digits. It's pretty low. Okay, so I think I've already made this point about the extent of Japanese FDI, and in particular, what we can see is that the opportunities for Japanese companies to shift from UK to elsewhere in Europe. It's not clear where, and there was, I mentioned this survey where they suggest that their number one choice would be Germany, number two choice would still be the UK, presumably because of the combination of English language and favorable regulatory environment, and maybe even just crossing their fingers that they'll still be able to be single passported in France and Italy. But there's a widespread sense that the Brexit is a minus for Japanese firms. For the bulk of Japanese firms, maybe not. So 60+% of the firms said there would be no effect on their own business. So when you look at those doing business with the UK, nearly half saw negative effects on their own business as well as for Japan as a whole. And certainly at a time in Japan where we have a low growth environment, weakness in the success of Abenomics, that each little bit that gets knocked off of external demand for Japanese firms becomes increasingly of concern. And so we see a variety of examples of this. In particular, this is the Sunderland investment. This gives a sense of where things are clustered. You can see that in particular that banking and tech is around London and nearby, whereas other categories are more spread around. This is actual employment by various employers. You can see the Fujitsu is at 14,000. This is not a small number of high-quality jobs for the UK. So maybe there are reasons for the UK to worry about it. Excuse me? I have no idea. Sunderland was actually, it was an interesting, it was considered a bellwether of the Brexit vote. It was one of the first districts to report. It reported very strongly not in Remain. And that was, I think, a real shock to the companies that had been investing up there. It's not just Nissan, but that when we saw the Sunderland thing, a lot of people, not just in Japan, but certainly in Japan as well, found that quite concerning because of what it seemed to say about the value that was placed on foreign direct investment. I've already gone through, I think, the currency effects and the effects on Japanese equity markets. So in the interest of keeping true to my promise to hit my 20-minute mark, I'm going to move on finally to a couple of brief comments on the issue of effects on global politics, because this is something that I think is not unique to Japan, but many people have commented that the UK vote might have profound effects on Europe, and it might also reflect profound things that are going on around the world. So one of these is that this interpretation that many have made, and this showed up in a lot of the Japanese commentary, that this is an anti-globalization vote in some way. That it is, in fact, what you might think of as a populist anti-globalization vote. And here there's some question about whether to what extent is this contagious. We may think of that in our own presidential election, but it's not completely clear. And this showed up in commentary in Japanese newspapers as well as the British and international ones, as to whether this is an anti-globalization story, or it's simply an anti-immigrant story, or it's an anti-nanny state story. The feeling of suffocation from the European Union, and I think as we all know that the UK has always had ambivalent feelings about the European project. The last big referendum in the UK, I believe, or maybe it was one of the major ones, was the agreement to go sort of all in on the common market, and that has been an ongoing conversation in the UK as to how far we're willing to accept this. So it may be, if that's the case, that this isn't sort of reflective of a larger global trend, that it might just be a one-off rather than a precedent for upcoming elections. And by the way, I say U.S.-European elections because there's a series of European elections that are pretty relevant here as well. And we can talk a little bit, and when I say a little bit, I really mean a little bit because the depth of my knowledge on European politics is limited. but about what those things might look like in terms of how this might change the effects of Brexit. So this is a question that persists in Japan, and I don't have a better answer for it. The other thing that comes up is the question of what this does to Europe as a concept. And here we see a lot of the same things that show up in the international newspapers. How will UK, which has been an important player in international relations, sometimes punching above its weight, one might argue, how does this change its approach to other countries, including China, Japan, and even Russia? There is, I will say, based on at least what I've been able to glean from English translations of the Chinese commentary, despite the concern about uncertainty, there's also a certain amount of schadenfreude about the idea of Little Britain. I think going back to many bad experiences back in the 19th century. But for Japan, which has seen UK as a dependable ally in a lot of ways, this question of how it operates as an independent player, whether it will be an independent player, whether it will continue the kowtow towards China that some have accused it of, is a major concern. We don't know what European foreign policy will look like without the UK. There's an argument that the UK has been important in having a more hardline response to Russia, which has some interest to Japan as well. And then, of course, there's these knock-on effects of the election in the upcoming election, upcoming elections, I should say. And there isn't an upcoming election in Scotland that I'm aware of, but that's just because they haven't planned it yet. There's every expectation to believe that Scotland, which was ambivalent about being part of the UK in the first place, is going to be more ambivalent about being part of a UK that's not part of the EU. In France, Netherlands, and Hungary, we have right-wing politicians who might well be taking power. Hungary, they already do, who might well have preferences for some of the same ways in which the UK has seen reducing the impact of the European Union in terms of acceptances of refugees, of labor of low-income labor particularly, and of the types of intrusion into economic policy making. Depending on how those things go, there might be a compromise to be made. But for now, I probably should have done this one quickly. We see that this is from South Korean Daily, Great Britain down to Little England, the Koreans concerned, Britain's showing a losing mindset. That sounds like something Donald Trump could have written, but it's actually the Chinese Global Times. And by the way, talking about Donald Trump, he shows up in the same alarmist cover as the story on Chiyokoron of the effects of Great Britain, of the Brexit vote. And finally, this Schadenfreude story of reflecting the general decline of Europe. So these are a variety of views that we're getting from East Asia. Of course, I think I feel the most comfortable on the economic story on the Japanese side, but it is an all-encompassing question and an all-encompassing approach to thinking about how this might have impact. It goes well beyond the trade channel, which, when you look at the trade, is of minor importance to most of the East Asian countries, but in terms of the idea that there's an earthquake in the world is significant. And, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Unlike Bill, Bill works on Japan, so like the Japanese is much more sort of organized. I work on India, so like the Indians are much less organized. But I want to sort of pose 2 or 3 points, like for our, to the discussions. What I want to argue is that Brexit might be a big deal, of course, for the UK and for the EU, but by itself it's not a big deal, like for Asia. However, the underlying factors that have driven the phenomenon of like Brexit are of much deeper concern. And that is, I think, a broad wave sweeping across the West, which is a backlash against globalization globalization, which has very severe or which may have severe impact both on geoeconomics and on geopolitics. I think there is a general sense that Brexit is a symptom of a deep disquiet in large parts of the populations of many industrialized countries, and that disquiet has found expression in many different ways. In the UK, it's Brexit. In the US, it's the Trump phenomenon. And in many sort of countries in Europe, it's the rise in support for right-wing populist parties and movements. It's a big puzzle why this has not resulted in a support for the left, which might have been the case 30, 40 years ago, and why has this shift why has populism found expression much more in the rise of like right-wing parties. Now, the usual suspects that are trotted out are trade, technological change, and migration. I think one that is focused less on is why the West sort of basically abandoned fiscal policy as an instrument of redistribution. And you can see it in the way you can see the profits of Apple, the way they are parked, and in the way you see Trump's tax returns. Both reflect a way in which taxation as an instrument of redistribution seems to have been largely abandoned in favor of monetary policy. And that seems to have come back to haunt many of the countries. Now, the interesting thing is, if one goes back about a quarter century, at the end of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War coincided with something that affected developing countries hugely, which was the so-called Washington Consensus, which was about that, which was sort of laid out that for developing countries, if they really wanted to grow, they needed to integrate themselves with global markets. So opening up to trade, to capital flows in particular, was seen as the way that they should grow. These prescriptions were met with fierce resistance from elites in developing countries. It was seen to be an instrument of economic imperialism of the West, especially of the G7, and embodied in the rise of the WTO. But ironically, exactly the opposite has happened. The last quarter century has seen the single biggest convergence of the rest with the West in the past 200 years. It is unprecedented in our history. And one could argue that a part of this disquiet actually reflects a loss of status of the West, a status that I think is not going to ever come back in this century. And this is the real underlying sort of geopolitical and geoeconomic changes that are taking place, and which, of course, is reflected most notably in the spectacular rise of China, which, of course, was a much smaller player in 1990, and soon is likely to be the largest economy. And much less, but still to a great extent, relative to its own past, the rise of India, whose economy was barely 300 billion in 1990, is now more than 2 trillion, and is the fastest growing economy in the world. Now, this part in which, even as many developing countries embraced globalization and what it has done for them, and the West actually, you see a break and a much greater disquiet. And in some ways, one could argue that Brexit is simply a sort of reflection of these deeper currents that are flowing. Now, the reactions from India to Brexit, I think, if Bill's point that there was schadenfreude about the UK, in India there's less schadenfreude about the UK. It's much more schadenfreude about the EU, actually. I think relations between India and the EU have been lukewarm for a long time. India finds the EU very sanctimonious and self-righteous. And frankly, by and large, now as a player in geopolitics, the Indian foreign ministry and defense ministry have largely given up on the EU. A trade deal that was being negotiated is basically has gone nowhere and is not going to go anywhere. Now, I think one way to sort of give you a flavor of this, a couple of years ago when India had its general elections, and a group of European academics was visiting my center, they got lots of phone calls from the EU media about the elections. So I would ask them, what do the journalists in Europe want to know about India? And they ask you. And they laughed and they said, oh, it's all about the 4 C's, chaos, caste, chaos, and corruption. By and large, that's the European view of India. And the Indians are very well aware of that sort of view. And I think they have very little patience now with the EU and this type of view. It is in the last quarter century of countries above 100 million, it's been the second largest growing economy. And in the last year and a half, it's been the fastest growing. And this is likely to continue as far as we can see over this decade. Now relations of India with the UK have, of course, had a sort of a special sort of relationship because of the colonial past. But it's not been as much a state-to-state like relationship. It's been much more about a relationship between business and society. For Indian businesses, actually, the UK is a major investment sort of destination. Actually, an Indian company, ironically, is the largest single employer in the UK in the manufacturing sector. It's a real delicious turn over 200 years. So the Tatas, which own Jaguar, Land Rover, and a few steel plants, etc., is the largest employer in the United Kingdom in the manufacturing center. But like as with Japan, the UK is not a big deal as a trade partner. It's about 3.5% of India's exports. Where it is very distinct from Japan is, of course, the Indian diaspora in the United Kingdom. Indians are the largest migrant groups in the UK, and as with the US, Indians are the highest income group also in the UK, as in the US. They are a very large source of remittances. It's about 5 billion annually, which vastly exceeds any other form of economic relationship between the two countries. Because unlike China, India's manufacturing companies have not done well, but actually London has been a base for India's IT companies to serve the UK market, in particular because Indian IT firms have established themselves, especially as the global back office for the financial sector. And London is, of course, the major financial sector, especially after New York. And so their worry is much more that will London's role as a financial sector come under some threat, or will it wane if with Brexit, and with that, will it affect Indian IT firms that serve the large financial sector in London? But also, by and large, I think they find EU regulations so onerous that many of them are pretty blasé, actually, about it not being part of Europe. One interesting thing which has been a big role of the UK, which has shaped India, which I call sort of disembodied globalization, which is the role of the UK as a source of ideas for Indian elites through higher education, which of course the entire Indian elite at the time of independence, they studied from Gandhi to Nehru. All of them had studied in the UK, and their ideas of Fabian socialism came from places like the LSE and Oxford and so on, and Cambridge. That has completely changed. The UK is absolutely not the preferred destination for Indian elites. And my data shows that within 2 years, the next 2 years, China will have more students from India than the UK. And that tells you just how much has changed. There's been a rapid decline in number of Indian students going to the UK. The US, of course, is by far the largest. But even places like Australia and Canada matter more than the UK. I think in thinking about the India's sort of underlying dispositions towards Brexit, I think it might be worthwhile spending a few minutes about the changing locus of India's strategic concerns with what is happening in Asia and its relations with specific countries in the EU. I think it's fair to say that the one country that India actually has now the closest relationship in security and defense in Europe is actually France. And that is perhaps the strongest relationship in security. India's major concerns are the Pakistan-China axis, and its entire posture is now gradually changing with a much, much stronger relationship emerging with both Japan and the United States. And in that, the EU and the UK are really big players. They're really not major factors in this changing calculus that is taking place. I think what is worrying Indian economic policymakers is something very different. They had spent the better part of 2 decades convincing Indian politicians and the Indian public that globalization indeed was a way for India to grow as rapidly as China. And they now feel that just when they really had convinced, and there's really no anti-globalization backlash in India now. It was huge 25 years ago. So just as when they were ready to join the party, the music is starting to fade. And so they are beginning to realize that the world simply cannot accommodate yet another giant country which uses exports as a way to grow. Because the degree to which India would take market share to capture anything like the way China grew in the past 3 decades, the community would simply not accept that. Markets are going to be much more closed, relatively speaking. And that engine of growth, which policymakers had thought, which would be exports, basically lagging China by a decade, that engine, they now realize those gates are not going to be as open. So there's a major rethinking about what should India's growth strategy be, and to what extent should India refocus on an internal engine of growth, consumption-led growth, rather than the export-led growth, which had basically been the mantra for many developing countries, starting with the East Asian Tiger, starting with Japan in the 50s, and then Korea, Taiwan, and then to Southeast Asia, followed by China. So I think the implications of Brexit by itself, yes, as I began with, will matter for the EU and for the UK, but the underlying factors that are driving it, which is a fear of globalization in the West, is going to have much deeper implications for geoeconomics and geopolitics and security. And much of those reverberations will be felt not in Europe or in the UK, but actually in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've had 2 really interesting and different perspectives on different aspects of the issue. And so now I turn to Bill Overholt to pull these 2 views together and offer his own comments. I want to particularly thank Bill for coming in fairly soon after he had a surgery, which might require him to get up and walk around at a certain point to keep from getting stiff. It is really
That's okay.
good of you to have come today. So, Bill.
Well, thanks. We've heard 2 very incisive talks, and I think about the effect of the EU crisis and Brexit, and we were given a broad assignment on Asia. My mind has a matrix. And matrix is their country level, substantive level first. Economic consequences, financial, political, geopolitical, and it's called broad ideological. And you can look at the consequences on the country level, on the region, or on ideas about regionalism, which I think is different. And we've covered two countries very, very incisively. I learned a lot, and I don't want to try to add a lot to that. We've got a giant matrix here, and so we need to pick out what are the high points, the points worth talking about in that matrix. We've hardly mentioned China. There are some consequences for China. So let me start by defining terms. That's all. It's a good place to start. And the EU and Brexit crisis, first of all, focus on Brexit, and we don't know what Brexit is yet. It could be hard, it could be soft. The key issues are passporting and the common market, as Bill said, versus, that's what Britain wants, versus freedom of movement, which the EU wants. And Britain's only going to get that passporting if every single country in the EU agrees. And there are some that don't. So we're probably going to see some pretty serious consequences. The negotiations are going to be tough. And divorces tend to be difficult, even when both parties start out trying to be rational. We've got a slow-growing EU in a major financial crisis, and this is going to tend to make the slow growth slower and the financial crisis worse. We've got a weaker euro and a weaker pound sterling, and we've got a very fragile EU. Now, I would argue that this is the first stage of the breakup of the EU. That's a big subject. I don't want to pursue it. I want to mention it because what you think the consequences are depends on what you believe about that. So I think we need to start by thinking that way. As London loses its role as a gateway, there's obviously going to be a slowdown of foreign direct investment. Asian countries are not going to know where to put their money during this period of uncertainty. The pound and the euro are going to be weak. That means the yen is going to be relatively strong, which is difficult for Japan. And above all, the US dollar is going to be strong. And I think Bill has fully explicated the very strong Japanese view. For slightly different reasons, the Chinese have a very strong view about keeping the EU together. We haven't talked much about financial markets. The City of London is going to take a hit. Its role in foreign exchange trading is already down from 41% of global trading to 37%. That sounds like a small change, but it's a market of $1.7 trillion a day. What's going to happen there is that Britain is actually going to gain relative to Singapore, and Britain is going to lose a lot more to Hong Kong. You see a tremendous strengthening of Hong Kong markets. London will keep most of its, will not lose any of its role I don't need that anyway, so don't worry about it.
Okay.
London will not lose its role as a fundraising capital to Paris or Frankfurt. The whole continent is so financially weak that they will remain dependent on London. But London will lose role to Hong Kong and to New York. And the Asian implications is continuous strengthening of the role of Hong Kong. What are the implications for regionalism? Well, two, I think. One, there was a tremendous push by the ADB with pressure coming from Japan for an Asian currency. And that was always a bad idea. But now it couldn't possibly look worse. Hopefully we won't hear anything more about that, and I suspect we won't. The other is that both the EU and ASEAN decided to emphasize breadth over depth, get more and more countries in at the expense of ensuring that those countries actually have common interests. And in both cases, that means you have great talk shops. And in the ASEAN conversation was key to the great Asian economic takeoff. It was the exchange, it was the talk shop, the exchange of economic ideas that was behind many of the successes of these countries. But it's hopeless of getting anything done, particularly now. EU has a similar problem, although it can get a lot more done than ASEAN. Fundamental lesson for regionalism of various kinds here. If you go for breadth over depth, you're never going to get anything done. In terms of the value of investments, in the short run, Japan's a big loser, and Bill has explained that. Japan has this portfolio of extraordinary investments, and those have just been devalued. China, on the other hand, is coming in. It's in the position that Japan was in the 1980s, and Europe is providing a fire sale. So China's, in those terms, the big winner. But if the EU continues to disintegrate, then China's foreign policy hopes for pinning down Europe as the opposite end of One Belt, One Road start to disappear. This means that when people like David Dollar say that China will be experiencing schadenfreude over Europe's disintegration, absolutely and totally wrong. The Chinese position is the same as the Japanese position. Their whole foreign policy vision depends on Europe holding together. The crisis, at least in the short run, puts China in position to anchor its One Belt, One Road strategy. Everything's on sale, cheap. Most symbolically, they buy the port of Piraeus in Greece. What could be better than to control a key European port, along with building all the railroads and so on? But again, the core of One Belt, One Road is networking everybody together, having a set of common standards. And that gets defeated, at least tactically, if Europe continues to disintegrate. For the U.S., it's one more diversion away from the pivot to Asia. U.S. has plenty of diversions in the Middle East away from its pivot to Asia. And basically, the pivot has never happened except moving a few ships. But again, the U.S. pivot concept is probably going to fail for the indefinite future. Not because it isn't a good idea, it is. The U.S. interests are concentrated across the Pacific. but the U.S. is continually going to be diverted to more urgent things. I want to come back finally to the most abstract level where Bill emphasized the globalization as the core issue. For some countries, it's globalization of trade and investment that's the key issue. For others, it's immigration. For the U.S., somehow it's become both. It's important to understand that Britain has been inoculated against worry about anti-globalization in trade and FDI. The Labour governments after World War II showed what happens when you go the Bernie-Trump route. British people are never going to go for that again. But for them, it's the immigration issue. For most of Europe, it's the immigration issue. Europe still fundamentally believes in trade and investment globalization, as does China and in its own way, India. Globalization of labor is the key issue. China increasingly welcomes that, and Europe and the U.S. are turning against it. Some theorists in China see globalization, they call it globalization of talent, as the key to China's future role as a world leader. They say the first globalization was industry, and that was Britain and the Industrial Revolution. The second globalization was finance, and that was led by New York, and that led to the role of the U.S. in the world today. And the third role is globalization. Third globalization is the globalization of talent. And you see China pulling in talent on the Singapore model from all over the world. This is going to be considerably de-emphasized under Xi Jinping compared with the last years of Hu Jintao, and the talent is going to be less interested in going there. But this is a key role. So I want to endorse what both speakers said about anti-globalization as the key issue and as the underlying cause of Brexit and the other problem. But I'll just conclude by taking it a step further. I think we're going to spend much of this century arguing over political representation. I think one of the things that's gone out the window in the last couple decades is a clear, almost universally accepted concept of political representation in this country. You know, Americans, when you had a problem, you used to go and write a letter to your congressman. Now Congress has a slightly higher trust rating than pedophiles. People go into the streets or they demand a referendum. And that creates a different system. Many British, 52%, don't think Europe represents them. Many people in Scotland don't think the UK represents them. A majority of people in the EU do not think that the EU represents their interests. And I don't want to try to elaborate it, but I think Japan and China are going to suffer the greatest crises over what is proper and effective representation in our system. I think the concept of a vanguard party that truly represents the interests of the people worked very well from 1979 to 2012. I don't think it's working now. I think in Japan, you've got a government whose top priorities are opposed by the overwhelming majority, much more so than Brexit of the population, and it's not addressing the key financial issues that are are going to determine Japan's future. So I don't think this is on the agenda yet. I think along with globalization, it's going to be the agenda for much of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much.